Most people drift through life like autumn leaves in the wind, tossed, turned, and ultimately forgotten. They seek comfort over clarity, approval over authenticity, and routine over reinvention. Their lives are built on sand, shaped by the opinions of others, and guided by the shallow compass of societal norms. And for many, that is enough, but not for you. You're here because you feel the tug of something more, a sense that life in all its chaos and confusion holds hidden codes waiting to be deciphered. Not everyone hears that call, but those who do are not meant to follow. They are meant to lead, to shape, to transcend. If that's you, then understand this. The battleground is not external. It is not your job, your family, your status, or your wealth. The true war is waged within, against the whispers of doubt, the lure of ease, and the chains of conformity. This is the story of Thomas Caldwell, a man born in the heartland of America, raised in the quiet suburbs of Indianapolis, but destined for something far beyond white picket fences and pension plans. His journey is not one of luck or legend. It is a story of deliberate transformation, a case study in psychological mastery, stoic resolve, and philosophical clarity. A story that mirrors the potential in all of us, if only we dare to listen, learn, and lead ourselves. At age 37, Thomas was a marketing director for a mid-sized tech firm in Chicago. On paper, he had made it. A comfortable six-figure salary, a nice home in Oak Park, a marriage that looked stable to outsiders, and two kids enrolled in good schools. But behind his calm demeanor, Thomas was suffocating. Each day felt like a loop, a sterile routine of emails, meetings, traffic, and surface-level conversations. He was not living. He was maintaining. And slowly, that truth began to eat at him. It began subtly. He found himself staring longer into the mirror in the mornings, searching for something behind his own eyes. Not fatigue, not age, but meaning. Then came the books: philosophy, psychology, history. He devoured the works of Carl Jung, Marcus Aurelius, Friedrich Nietzsche, and even Niccolò Machiavelli. Not for comfort, but for confrontation. He wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for weapons, mental tools to fight his way out of the cage he hadn't realized he'd built. The first key he discovered was detachment, emotional detachment, not as a cold shoulder to the world, but as a protective shield for the mind. When your happiness is built on circumstances, you become a slave to outcomes. But when your peace is rooted in internal discipline, no external chaos can shake you. Thomas stopped reacting to every trigger, every email, every disappointing glance. He began observing his own patterns, his automatic responses, his internal narratives. It was during a Monday meeting, surrounded by colleagues arguing over a pitch, that he realized the power of silence. He said nothing. He watched. And in that stillness, he saw what no one else did: the insecurity behind the outburst, the desperation behind the aggression. It was as if the room became transparent, and at that moment, Thomas took his first step out of mediocrity, not with words, but with awareness. This story isn't about becoming someone else. It's about reclaiming who you were before the world told you who to be. Thomas's transformation began not with grand declarations, but with quiet revolutions inside his own mind. And if you've ever felt that your life was on autopilot, that you were meant for more than sleepwalk cycles and empty smiles, then this story is your reflection. You were not born to blend, you were born to break the mold. And over the next chapters, you will learn how. Piece by piece, insight by insight. This is not just a story, it is a guide, a blueprint, a mirror. And the first truth you must hold is this: before you can master anything else, you must first master yourself. The world teaches us early: react, respond, obey. But those who live reactively live predictably, and those who live predictably are easy to control. The second transformation in Thomas Caldwell's journey began when he understood this fundamental truth. He who reacts is already owned. He who observes is free. This understanding didn't arrive through a motivational quote or a weekend seminar. It came in the form of a personal collapse. Thomas had just wrapped a major product launch at his company. Months of sleepless nights, internal politics, and high-stakes meetings. He had sacrificed family time, health, and his own mental peace to make it a success. And then, on the day of the board presentation, the credit went to someone else. The old Thomas would have fought back, emails, phone calls, heated debates. But the new Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he detached. He saw the game for what it was. He realized that his ego, his hunger for recognition, had made him vulnerable. That day, Thomas began building what he later called his mental perimeter, a space between stimulus and response, a space where he could breathe, observe, and choose. Detachment isn't withdrawal, it's control. When you detach emotionally from the need for validation, you become invincible to insult and immune to praise. You stop letting the world jerk you like a puppet. Neuroscience confirms what the Stoics knew centuries ago. Emotional regulation leads to higher executive function, better decision-making, and deeper resilience. In short, detachment rewires the brain for clarity. That shift affected every aspect of Thomas's life. In his marriage, he no longer argued over the small things. He listened not to win, but to understand. In his role as a father, he stopped reacting with a frustration and started leading with grounded presence. At work, he became a force of calm in the midst of chaos. And people noticed. They couldn't figure him out. He wasn't aloof, but he was unshakable. He became the eye of the storm. This is not about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming emotionally sovereign. Thomas didn't suppress how he felt. He simply refused to be ruled by it. He replaced impulsive anger with quiet strategy, resentment with focused detachment. He learned to observe his own mind like a scientist studying a subject, not a man drowning in feelings. That ability became his edge. It's a paradox of life. The less you need control, the more you gain it. And when others try to provoke, to manipulate, to bait, you respond with stillness. Because nothing disturbs the man who has already anchored himself. Thomas began to experience a new kind of power, one the loud, explosive kind, but the silent, immovable kind. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The kind that simply is. So ask yourself, how much of your life have you spent reacting? How many of your days have been shaped by emotion rather than intention? If you want to evolve, you must build your own mental perimeter. Create that sacred space between what happens and how you respond. That is where freedom lives. That is where power begins. And once you taste that kind of control, you'll never trade it for the cheap comfort of reaction again. Because in a world of noise, the quiet mind commands the room. One of the greatest illusions in modern life is the belief that speaking more equals strength. Yet Thomas Caldwell learned, as many before him, that silence, when used with precision, is not emptiness. It is pressure. And pressure, when held in stillness, becomes influence. It was during a quarterly leadership retreat in Denver where Thomas first witnessed this in action. A heated discussion had broken out among department heads about budget cuts and resource allocation. Voices clashed, tempers flared. Everyone wanted to be heard. But in the corner of the room sat Olivia Grant, the company's legal advisor. She said nothing. She watched, listened, and waited. 30 minutes passed before she spoke, and when she did, the room fell silent, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. Her words, measured and sharp, shifted the direction of the entire meeting. That night, something clicked for Thomas. Silence, used intentionally, is not a void. It is a vacuum that pulls others in. People fear silence because it reveals insecurity. Most fill it with needless chatter, exposing desires, weaknesses, and unfiltered emotions. But those who master silence radiate control. Neuroscience shows that the brain, when faced with ambiguity, like prolonged silence, goes into prediction mode. This creates tension, and tension creates influence. Thomas began experimenting. He stopped interrupting in meetings. He paused before answering questions. He allowed space to hang heavy in conversations. And what he discovered was profound. People began revealing more. They leaned in. They second-guessed themselves. They began to project power onto him, simply because he no longer sought to prove himself. Silence is not passivity, it is strategy. In negotiation, it is the pause that compels the other to speak first. In conflict, it is the stillness that disarms aggression. In leadership, it is the restraint that builds trust. People assume that those who speak less know more, and often they're right, because silence requires self-control, awareness, and confidence. In his personal life, this shift created deeper intimacy. With his children, Thomas found that listening without rushing to fix their problems gave them space to process and grow. With his wife, moments of shared quiet carried more connection than hours of forced dialogue. In friendships, he became the anchor, the one people turned to not for answers, but for a perspective. Thomas adopted a rule: speak only when your words are stronger than your silence. This became his compass, not out of pride, but out of wisdom. Because every time he withheld a reaction, every time he chose presence over noise, he deepened his power. He learned to speak with purpose, not habit. This lesson is not about muting yourself. It's about mastering timing, tone, and truth. It's about recognizing that real presence doesn't come from dominating the air, but from owning the space. And in a world addicted to attention, the one who listens becomes the rarest and most powerful presence in the room. If you want to lead, to persuade, to command respect, start with your silence. Train it, use it, let it speak louder than the noise. Because those who control silence control the conversation. Thomas Caldwell's transformation deepened when he understood a truth most never confront. Emotions, while deeply human, are tools, or they are traps. In a world that celebrates impulsivity as authenticity, few realize that unchecked emotion is not freedom. It is captivity. And the one who cannot master his feelings will always be mastered by others. His realization began after a public incident at work. A younger colleague had openly challenged Thomas in a meeting, accusing him of stalling a project. The old Thomas would have taken it personally, defending himself with logic and tone. But this time he did something different. He paused. He breathed. He said nothing for a moment, then calmly offered clarity without defensiveness. What followed was stunning. The tension dissolved, respect shifted, and the entire room took note. That day, Thomas discovered the psychological law of controlled emotion. He saw it in action. Emotions are energy. Left unchecked, they erupt. But when channeled, they become power. Research in emotional intelligence confirms that people who can regulate emotional responses outperform peers in leadership, negotiation, and conflict resolution. This isn't theory, it's measurable, life-altering fact. Thomas began training himself like a soldier of the mind. He practiced reframing situations, viewing personal slights as data, not daggers. He turned frustration into fuel for discipline. He used fear as a signal to prepare, not to retreat. Anger became a fire for boundaries, not a flame for destruction. This internal discipline began to separate him from his peers. While others drowned in waves of reaction, Thomas walked the shoreline, calmly steering his course. In relationships, this shift was profound. His children no longer feared his temper because it was no longer reactive. His marriage began to heal, not because problems vanished, but because he no longer escalated conflict. He became, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, a rock against which waves crash, only to break themselves. The greatest enemy of clarity is not ignorance, it is emotion without command. Our brains are hardwired to respond to stress with fight, flight, or freeze. But neuroscience has proven that mindful regulation, training the brain to pause, literally changes neural pathways. Emotional mastery isn't mysticism, it's neuroplasticity. Thomas learned to observe his emotions like clouds passing across the sky. He no longer feared them. He didn't suppress them. He studied them. And in doing so, he became less predictable, more strategic, and, perhaps most importantly, more present. He stopped losing hours to spirals of anger or days to emotional hangovers. He reclaimed his time, his energy, and his control. To lead others, you must first lead yourself. And to lead yourself, you must become the master of your emotional fire. Feel deeply, but act deliberately. That is where real power lives. In a world obsessed with outward strength, the greatest warriors are those who conquer their inner world first. Ask yourself, who pulls your strings? What triggers control you? And what would your life look like if you responded always from a place of choice rather than compulsion? That is not fantasy, that is discipline. And like Thomas, you can begin today, because the one who holds the leash of his own mind holds the leash of his life. Observation is a forgotten art in a culture obsessed with noise. But for Thomas Caldwell, mastering observation became his superpower. It began not with telescopes or spy tactics, but with something far simpler: paying attention, truly, deeply paying attention. The transformation started on his morning commute. Where he once drowned the drive in podcasts or calls, Thomas began turning off the noise. He watched people, not just their actions, but their micro-expressions, body language, energy shifts. He noticed patterns: the rushed businessman tapping his foot at the stoplight, the mother scanning the school entrance with fatigue in her eyes, the teenager with restless hands and darting glances. Each was a book of unspoken truths, and Thomas read them like scripture. At work, this practice elevated him from competent to cunning. He started observing his colleagues, not just what they said, but how they said it: the tone, the pacing, the eyes that flickered downward when they were uncertain. He noticed who leaned in during meetings and who crossed their arms when threatened. He tracked whose mood changed after each leadership memo and who always smiled too quickly. These weren't coincidences. They were signals. Behavioral science supports this. Humans leak information constantly through nonverbal cues. A study from UCLA found that up to 93% of communication is nonverbal: tone, facial expression, posture. In short, most people say more when they're not speaking, but only the observant catch it. Thomas began documenting patterns. He had a journal, small, leather-bound, discreet, where he'd note trends, behaviors, even inconsistencies. He didn't use it to judge. He used it to understand, and understanding gave him power. In negotiations, he predicted objections before they surfaced. In hiring, he sensed when someone's confidence was a mask for chaos. In leadership, he noticed which employees were on the verge of burnout before HR did. This skill also reshaped his home life. He started picking up the subtle signs of emotional strain in his wife before tension erupted. He noticed when his son was retreating behind screens to avoid something deeper. He saw the stress signals in his daughter's silence, not just her words. He wasn't a mind reader. He was simply present, and presence is rare. There's a philosophical component to observation too. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Thomas applied this dual gaze: outward for patterns, inward for purpose. He observed the world not to manipulate, but to align. He realized that most people walk blind through life, missing everything that matters while chasing everything that doesn't. Observation taught Thomas one final brutal truth: people will tell you who they are if you let them speak long enough, and show you who they are if you stay quiet long enough. You don't need to expose others. Just let them reveal themselves. To develop this power, you don't need more knowledge. You need more silence, more stillness, more attention. Train your eye to see what others miss. Train your ear to hear what others filter. Train your mind to analyze without judgment. Because the world is a chessboard, and those who fail to observe remain pawns, but those who see the board control the game. So choose today. Will you walk blind through the noise, or will you awaken your vision and see what others cannot? Thomas Caldwell didn't start out disciplined. Like most, he wrestled with procrastination, fatigue, and the modern addiction to comfort. But there came a day, an ordinary Tuesday in fact, when he looked in the mirror and saw a man built by convenience, not conviction. That day he made a vow: comfort would no longer be his compass. Discipline would be his crown. Self-discipline isn't glamorous. It's not the stuff of motivational posters or social media flexes. It is early mornings when your body aches. It is saying no when your instincts beg for yes. It is doing what must be done, again and again, especially when no one is watching. And Thomas chose this path not out of pride, but out of necessity, because he had learned a brutal truth: without discipline, intelligence is wasted and potential becomes a burden. He began small, waking up at 5:30 a.m. each day, rain or shine, cold showers, journaling for clarity. Right, not for aesthetics, but for mental resilience. He applied this rigor to his work: deep, uninterrupted focus blocks, strict email limits, and purposeful delegation. Every area of his life came under scrutiny. Finances, health, even digital consumption, nothing escaped the audit. What Thomas found was astonishing. As his discipline grew, so did his freedom. The more he constrained his impulses, the more his mind expanded. The less he chased dopamine highs, the clearer his long-term vision became. He read more books in 6 months than he had in 6 years. He reclaimed hours of his life from distractions. He didn't become robotic. He became precise. Neuroscience explains this transformation. Self-discipline activates the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for decision-making and impulse control. The more you train it, the stronger it gets, like a muscle. And over time, Thomas's willpower became second nature, not because he was superhuman, but because he built the system. He stopped relying on motivation and built structure. In his relationships, discipline meant emotional control. He learned to pause before reacting, to walk away rather than escalate, to speak from clarity rather than from ego. As a father, it meant being present, setting boundaries with love, not with anger. As a husband, it meant showing up when it was inconvenient, not just when it was easy. Discipline sharpened not just his habits, but his character. In business, it made him rare. While others jumped from strategy to strategy, Thomas stayed the course. He became known for his consistency, his reliability, and his relentless execution. He wasn't always the loudest voice in the room, but he was often the most respected, because results speak and discipline delivers. But make no mistake, this wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, days when he failed, weeks when he doubted. But every time he fell, he returned, not with guilt, but with resolve. Because discipline at its core is not about perfection. It's about return, about choosing the long road over the quick fix every day. And so the question for you is simple. Who do you become when no one is watching? What does your life look like when comfort is no longer king? If you want to be exceptional, stop chasing ease. Build structure, build standards, build the life you were meant for, not the one that requires the least effort. Because discipline is not the enemy of freedom. It is its foundation. And those who wear it as their crown never bow to the chaos of the world. The next evolution in Thomas Caldwell's journey was subtle but seismic. It wasn't built on force, domination, or louder voices. It was built on influence, the invisible hand that bends minds, guides decisions, and rewrites outcomes without a single command. Influence became his quiet empire. It started with a realization. People aren't moved by facts. They're moved by emotions, by identity, by stories that align with their desires or fears. Thomas had spent years trying to convince others with logic alone. He'd debate, explain, and out-reason, but all that ever earned him was resistance. Then he shifted. He began listening more closely, not just to words, but to emotional undercurrents. In meetings, he'd ask questions not to challenge, but to reveal. Instead of pushing ideas, he seeded them, letting others feel they had discovered the insight themselves. In doing so, he learned one of the most powerful psychological truths. People support what they help create. Behavioral psychology confirms this. The IKEA effect, a cognitive bias, shows that people value things more when they've had a hand in creating them. Thomas used this in business, in parenting, even in conflict resolution. Influence was no longer about control. It was about co-creation, perception, and timing. He also mastered frames. In any interaction, whoever controls the frame controls the dynamic. If he entered a room with calm authority, others adapted to that frame. If he withheld approval subtly, others sought it. Influence, he learned, is not loud. It is atmospheric. It changes the air when you walk in, and it begins with how you see yourself. Thomas began embodying the traits he wanted others to reflect. Calm, competence, presence. People don't follow titles, they follow energy, and he crafted his carefully. This wasn't manipulation. It was alignment. His outer influence flowed from his inner stability. He also understood that influence required restraint. He didn't try to win every argument. He didn't react to every provocation. He chose his words as a builder chooses bricks, thoughtfully, purposefully. He used silence as a tool, eye contact as a statement, body language as punctuation. Every piece mattered. In relationships, this made him magnetic. His wife noticed at first how he began to lead with steadiness instead of demand. His children responded next, more open, more trusting. Friends came to him for counsel, not out of neediness, but respect. He had become the gravity in the room. But influence also brought responsibility. Thomas never used it to manipulate for selfish gain. He used it to elevate conversations, to steer chaos into order, to create outcomes that serve truth. Because true influence, he believed, was not about bending others to your will. It was about awakening their higher selves without them realizing it. If you want to hold real power, start here. Understand what people crave: certainty, belonging, meaning, and offer it through your presence. Speak less, listen more. Frame situations intentionally, and always ensure your influence comes from integrity, because anything else eventually collapses. In a world of noise, the man who moves others without shouting, the man who shapes direction without force, he is rare. He is respected. He is followed. And if you build that kind of influence, you won't need to demand power. You'll already have it. If influence was the art of the unseen, then timing was the blade Thomas Caldwell learned to wield with ruthless precision. Most people think success comes from talent or opportunity, but Thomas discovered a deeper truth. Even the sharpest blade is useless if swung too soon or too late. Timing is what separates noise from strategy, motion from impact. The lesson came during a deal negotiation. A rival firm had made an aggressive bid to acquire one of Thomas's longtime clients. The younger Thomas might have reacted impulsively, fired off counteroffers, panicked, tried to salvage the relationship through desperation. But not this time. He waited. He let silence do its work. He watched. He gathered data. He noticed subtle signals: the client's hesitation, the rival firm's overconfidence, the emerging cracks in their offer. Then, at the right moment, he struck. One call, one solution, one perfectly timed message that addressed the client's hidden fear and reframed the entire conversation. The client stayed, the rival firm lost credibility, and Thomas didn't just win a deal, he won trust. He understood what the Stoics taught centuries ago: patience is not passive. It is strength held in reserve. It is the ability to delay gratification, to resist emotional urgency, to let others overplay their hand. In war, business, and even relationships, the man who can wait out his opponent owns the battlefield. Thomas applied this everywhere. At work, he didn't speak first in meetings. He listened, measured the emotional temperature, and then injected clarity when it mattered. At home, he learned when to address conflict and when to wait for the right emotional window. Even in investing and career moves, he chose precision over speed. He knew that waiting isn't weakness, it's preparation. This mindset gave him an edge that few could see. People around him were addicted to immediacy: quick wins, fast answers, instant relief. They rushed into deals, into relationships, into opinions. Thomas, by contrast, became the still point in a spinning world. And from that stillness, he moved only when it mattered. Timing also revealed a deeper psychological truth. Most people crave closure. They fear ambiguity. That's why silence and patience are so unnerving. When Thomas withheld a decision or a reaction, people revealed more. They filled the space with information he could use. And when he finally acted, it felt inevitable. One of his mentors once told him, "Never swing first unless it ends the fight." Thomas lived by it. Whether in boardrooms or family dynamics, he stopped throwing punches to feel powerful. He started landing them when they counted. To master timing, Thomas disciplined his impulses. He built internal stillness. He learned to delay, to observe, to feel the rhythm of conversations and decisions. And most importantly, he trusted the long game. Because in life, the man who moves last often moves best. Reflect on moments when you might be moving with haste. Are your choices guided by careful thought or momentary impulse? When you take a moment to see the bigger picture, you can proceed with confidence. Acting with clear intention, rather than out of habit, greatly improves your positive contributions. Proper timing is a gentle force until the right opportunity appears. When the moment is right, it can bring about significant, constructive developments. As Thomas Caldwell improved his focus and timing, he discovered a guiding principle. Emotional self-reliance is the foundation of true personal strength. When you are guided by your own values, rather than the perceptions of others, you achieve genuine independence. This was a lesson that came from a period of meaningful self-discovery. After presenting a high-stakes proposal to his company's executive board, Thomas expected acknowledgement, praise, something. But the room was quiet. Days passed with no feedback. In the past, this silence would have crushed him. He'd spiral into overthinking, rewrite the proposal obsessively, or seek affirmation from peers. But now something had shifted. He didn't chase approval. He didn't interpret silence as failure. He simply moved forward. Why? Because he no longer built his self-worth on external reactions. His validation came from within, from preparation, integrity, and alignment with his values. That moment marked his emotional emancipation. Most people are emotional hostages. Their confidence rises and falls with compliments or criticism. They fear rejection, so they conform. They crave belonging, so they betray themselves. But Thomas understood a Stoic principle that few embody. Your peace must be internal, immune to the applause or boos of the crowd. Emotional independence doesn't mean becoming cold or unfeeling. It means feeling deeply, but choosing consciously. It means caring without clinging, loving without losing yourself, and leading without needing to be liked. Thomas still listened to feedback, still valued relationships, but they no longer dictated his identity. He saw how emotional dependence made others manipulable. Bosses dangled praise to extract extra hours. Friends withheld support to provoke insecurity. Even in romantic relationships, emotional leverage was used as currency. But when you're free from the need to be liked, you become unbribable. And the world doesn't know what to do with a person who cannot be controlled through fear or flattery. Thomas embodied this at work. When a senior partner tried to sway him with veiled threats, implying that a promotion depended on loyalty, Thomas didn't flinch. He stated his truth, clarified his position, and walked away from the meeting with clarity. That act, simple yet rare, sent ripples through the organization. He wasn't reckless. He was sovereign. And at home, this independence deepened intimacy. Because he no longer relied on his family to make him feel worthy, he could show up more fully for them, and he was present, not needy, loving, not performative. His children felt it, his wife respected it. Emotional independence, he realized, is the doorway to authentic connection. To cultivate this in yourself, start by noticing where your emotions depend on others. Where do you shrink for approval? Where do you bend out of fear? Then practice anchoring inward. Build your worth on your discipline, your values, your growth. Journal, reflect, reclaim. The world will always try to shake you through criticism, silence, praise, or rejection. But if you remain grounded, you become unshakable. And once you no longer need the world to validate your existence, you walk through it with a rare, quiet kind of strength. That's when people stop seeing you as just another voice and start seeing you as a presence, not because you need them, but because you don't. To those who watch from the outside, Thomas Caldwell seemed calm, focused, resolute. But what they didn't see was the secret behind his growing strength, his ability to adapt, ruthlessly and without ego. In a world that clings to fixed identities and predictable habits, Thomas chose evolution. It began during an economic downturn. The company he'd helped build for years was restructuring. Departments dissolved, projects were shelved, roles were shifted. The old Thomas might have resisted, clinging to the security of what he'd earned. But this version of Thomas saw something clearer. Adaptability wasn't a threat. It was survival. So he pivoted. When his marketing team was absorbed into another division, he volunteered to lead a cross-functional initiative on innovation, something entirely outside his original expertise. He dove into product design, data analytics, and consumer psychology. He learned quickly, failed publicly, and adjusted constantly. And in doing so, he made himself indispensable. Psychologists call this cognitive flexibility. the capacity to shift thinking, to reframe challenges, and to learn under pressure. It's the trait that determines who thrives during change and who breaks under it. Thomas didn't fear the unknown. He mastered it because he understood that life doesn't reward rigidity, it rewards reinvention. In his personal life, this mindset changed everything. When old parenting approaches stopped working with his teenage son, he didn't double down out of pride. He adapted. He learned new communication methods, adjusted his presence, and met his son in a new season of life. When his marriage entered a period of distance, he didn't assign blame. He evolved, initiating honest conversations, letting go of control, and rediscovering connection through change. Thomas studied predators in nature, especially wolves and big cats. They survive not because they dominate every environment in, but because they read terrain, shift strategies, and adapt to the hunt. Human nature is no different. Those who stay rigid are easily outmaneuvered, but the adaptable remain dangerous. He applied this to identity too. Thomas no longer said, "I'm just not a numbers guy," or "I've never been good at networking." He erased those self-imposed limits. Identity, he realized, is not static. It is a toolkit. And if one tool no longer worked, he reached for another. This made him fluid, unpredictable, and increasingly powerful. Adaptability also demanded something deeper, the willingness to let go of what no longer served him. Relationships, beliefs, routines, even outdated goals. Thomas shed them without sentimentality, not from coldness, but from clarity. Growth meant cutting ties with versions of himself that were no longer aligned. This is what most people fear, not failure, but reinvention, the death of who they were. But Thomas embraced it. He saw every shedding as a rebirth, and from those ashes, he rose sharper, leaner, more dangerous. You must ask yourself, what have you outgrown but still cling to? What identity are you protecting that no longer reflects your highest potential? If you want to lead, evolve. If you want to stay relevant, adapt. If you want to be untouchable, become formless. Because no one can trap what shifts shape, and no one can defeat the man who always has another move. With adaptability as his armor, Thomas Caldwell began to sense something few men ever touch. Legacy. Not as fame or fortune, but as the quiet echo of cold power. The kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't beg. It shapes reality without announcing its arrival. Cold power is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the discipline to act without emotion when emotion clouds judgment. It is the strength to delay gratification, to trade applause for impact, and to endure loneliness when truth demands it. Thomas had earned this power, not through manipulation, but through mastery. At work, he no longer chased titles. He built systems, teams, processes, ideas that would outlast his presence. He didn't need credit anymore because influence had replaced validation. He designed strategy that others implemented. When decisions had to be made, eyes turned to him, not because he demanded attention, but because he had become synonymous with certainty. At home, cold power meant presence, not perfection. It meant offering calm in storms, offering boundaries, not ultimatums. His children began to model his emotional steadiness. His marriage evolved into quiet trust. Two people committed to a shared mission, not a romanticized performance. But the true transformation came in how he handled adversity. When a close colleague betrayed him in a high-stakes deal, Thomas didn't retaliate. He recalculated. When illness struck a family member, he didn't spiral. He created structure. Cold power is the ability to remain unbroken, not because life is gentle, but because your foundation is steel. He studied leaders, ancient and modern. Marcus Aurelius, Nelson Mandela, Abraham Lincoln. All of them knew this truth. The strongest force in the room is the one not ruled by force. It is the one that holds its line, remains unmoved, and acts only when impact is assured. Thomas also learned to conserve energy. Not every battle deserved a blade. Some deserve silence. Some deserve strategy. Cold power isn't about always being right. It's about always being effective. He chose his fights, and when he did strike, it was final. In moments of chaos, people gravitated to him, not for comfort, but for direction. His calm became contagious. His logic became trusted. His silence carried more weight than others shouting. This is the essence of legacy, not what you build, but what you leave behind in the minds of others. To build cold power, Thomas sacrificed short-term wins for long-term position. He let others chase credit while he secured control. He declined reactive decisions in favor of moves that played out over months. He thought in years, not days. You can do the same. If you stop needing to be seen and start needing to be effective, if you stop reacting and start structuring, if you stop chasing and start architecting, that is how legacy is built. Not through noise, but through quiet consistency. Not through bravado, but through silent dominance. And not through 100 small victories, but through one unwavering presence that shapes everything it touches. Because cold power doesn't beg to be noticed. It demands to be respected. And once you hold it, the world moves differently around you. As Thomas Caldwell matured into a man of quiet power, he realized that the battlefield was no longer external. It wasn't his job, his reputation, or even his legacy. The final frontier was within, the war between his higher self and the whispers of weakness that lingered beneath the surface. And the weapon that would determine the victor? Mastery of thought. Our thoughts shape our emotions, our actions, and ultimately our fate. Thomas began tracking his internal dialogue like an investigator. Every complaint, every excuse, every anxious spiral was documented. What he discovered shocked him. Most of his thoughts weren't his. They were echoes. Echoes from childhood, culture, media, and fear. And until he rewired those mental scripts, he would remain shackled by illusions. So he went to war. Not with rage, but with rigor. Every morning, he reviewed his journals, confronted his patterns, and reframed his narratives. He replaced self-pity with ownership, comparison with gratitude, and worry with execution. Slowly, he began to clean the lens through which he viewed the world. It wasn't easy, but it was liberation. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, teaches that our thoughts create our emotions, not the other way around. Neuroscience confirms it. When you change your internal language, your brain rewires itself. This isn't pop psychology. This is transformation rooted in biology. Thomas adopted mantras, not as affirmations, but as internal laws. I respond, I don't react. I move in truth, not in need. I act from principle, not pressure. These weren't phrases to chant. They were principles to embody. Over time, they became his mental software, running silently, guiding decisions. He also curated his environment. He stopped consuming anything that corrupted his clarity, gossip, distraction, emotional noise. He fed his mind only what sharpened it: philosophy, psychology, strategy. He spent time with people who challenged his thinking, not those who dulled it. And when isolation was necessary, he embraced it, not as loneliness, but as refinement. This shift spilled into every corner of life. He no longer spiraled when plans changed. He adapted. He no longer feared what others thought, because he trusted his own mind more. He no longer sought to control everything outside, because he had mastered everything inside. People began to describe him differently: grounded, wise, unshakable. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had silenced the noise. And in a world of chaos, that kind of mental stability becomes magnetic. Ask yourself, what thoughts are shaping your life? Are they reactive or intentional? Are they your own or inherited? If you want to rise, you must first reclaim your inner narrative. Because nothing outside of you is more powerful than the voice you believe within you. You can change your mind, and when you do, you change your life. Not instantly, but inevitably. Build that mind like a fortress. Let truth be the walls, discipline the guards, and clarity the light that never flickers. Because the man who commands his thoughts cannot be broken. Not by circumstance, not by failure, not even by fear. He becomes a lighthouse in a storm, not moving, not shouting, just standing, guiding others home while never drifting himself. One crisp October evening, Thomas Caldwell stood on the rooftop of his office building, watching the city below flicker and pulse with energy. Traffic buzzed, phones lit up, people moved with urgency. But Thomas felt still, so still that he could finally hear something deeper. the quiet rhythm of purpose. For years, he had climbed, built, improved, but now he understood the real pursuit wasn't success. It was alignment. And with that realization came the most powerful lesson of all. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build into the present, moment by moment, decision by decision, life lived by design, not by default. Legacy begins the moment you stop performing and start embodying. Thomas stopped chasing metrics and started mentoring others. He began investing not just in results, but in people, in clarity, in courage, in character. He saw that the impact he made on others would far outlive the titles he held or the deals he closed. This shift made him dangerous in the best way, because legacy-driven men are not easily distracted. They don't need credit. They don't seek noise. They build with depth, not decoration. Thomas stopped being reactive to trends, gossip, or ego battles. He operated from a different level, a long-viewed lens, a 10-year vision. He asked himself daily, what values will I make visible today? Not what do I feel, not what do others expect, but what do I want to etch into the memory of this moment, this family, this team? That single question sharpened his actions, his words, and his presence. Even small moments became sacred. A hard conversation with an employee became an opportunity to shape courage. A bedtime story with his daughter became a practice in attention. A failed project became a test of resilience, not reputation. This is what legacy looks like. Not the statue, but the standard. Thomas began to notice something else. Peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the earned peace of integrity. He no longer lived split between who he was and who he pretended to be. He no longer feared silence. He no longer needed applause. Because when your life becomes a reflection of your highest truths, your mind becomes your sanctuary. He wrote a letter to his children, sealed it, placed it in a safe. In it, he didn't list achievements. He listed principles. Be the one who calms the room. Be the one who honors discipline over desire. Be the one who listens longer. Be the one who finishes what others fear to start. That letter wasn't for their childhood. It was for their own stormy seasons ahead. Legacy is not the mansion. It's the blueprint you hand down. It's the mindset encoded into the lives you touch. It's the way your name is spoken when you're not in the room. And for Thomas, that truth became his compass. You too must choose. Chase moments or shape decades. Be remembered for presence or forgotten for performance. If you want to build something unshakable, begin not with what you do, but with who you are. Because when you live aligned with purpose, your life becomes a silent revolution. One that never ends, even when you do. By now, Thomas Caldwell had become something few people ever dared to become. Whole, not perfect, not invincible, but aligned, internally anchored, externally effective. And as his presence grew, so did something else, responsibility. Because when you master yourself, you're no longer just living for survival. You're living as a signal. The world took notice. Young professionals sought his mentorship, not because he had all the answers, but because he embodied the right questions. His children began asking deeper things, not just about careers or grades, but about meaning, failure, and courage. His marriage no longer revolved around managing tasks, but around building legacy together. Everything he touched became infused with a kind of quiet power that left no fingerprints but shaped every outcome. He no longer needed to convince, defend, or assert. His clarity did the work for him. His standards were silent, but they trained people how to treat him. His boundaries were firm, not harsh. Clear lines drawn not out of fear, but out of honor. He didn't shrink for comfort or stretch for approval. He simply stood where truth demanded. But here's what few understood. This wasn't luck. It wasn't personality. It was architecture. Thomas had built his life like a fortress, one value at a time. And in that fortress lived principles: detachment, discipline, observation, timing, emotional independence, adaptability, influence, all forged in experience, all tested by hardship, a line earned. He kept a document, his personal code, a living record of what he believed, how he chose to act, and who he chose to become. He reviewed it monthly, not as a checklist, but as a mirror. Because in a noisy world, you don't rise by doing more. You rise by remembering who you are. One evening during a leadership retreat, he was asked to define success. He didn't mention income, influence, or status. He paused, then said, "Success is when your mind and your actions no longer contradict. When your life whispers the same truth your soul screams." That line stayed with everyone in the room, not because it was profound, but because it was lived. You see, the final stage of transformation is not about collecting wins. It's about becoming a person who doesn't need the scoreboard anymore. Someone who doesn't just walk into a room differently, but sees the world differently. Someone who has made peace with pain, clarity with case, and purpose with uncertainty. This is not a hero's journey. This is a human one. A journey available to anyone willing to strip away distraction, rewire their patterns, and replace noise with principle. Thomas didn't become exceptional through grand gestures. He became exceptional through daily alignment. So wherever you are in your own path, understand this. There is no moment that suddenly makes you ready. You don't find strength in the future. You build it now in the small choices, the quiet disciplines, the thoughts you correct before they become beliefs. That is the path, not to perfection, but to power. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more clarity. And that starts with you. Not someday, but now. Thomas Caldwell didn't retire with a viral speech or a confetti-filled banquet. There was no dramatic farewell or sudden exit. He simply transitioned gracefully, intentionally, into the next version of his life. And those who had followed his journey knew this was fitting. Because real power doesn't exit with noise. It echoes through influence. He moved with purpose into mentorship, family, writing. Not to slow down, but to deepen. His days became quieter but sharper. Mornings began with reflection, not reaction. Conversations were slower, but richer. He wasn't driven by urgency anymore. He was guided by clarity. And perhaps the most remarkable part, he was still learning, still refining, still shedding. Because mastery, Thomas had come to realize, isn't a destination. It's a disposition, a commitment to becoming sharper, wiser, more essential as time passes. Not to prove anything, but to serve something bigger than ego. His legacy wasn't built in a moment. It was etched across decades, in how he handled tension, how he adapted under fire, how he spoke when it mattered most, and how he led when others panicked. His children didn't remember every word he said. They remembered how he made them feel in difficult moments. Safe, seen, challenged. Former colleagues didn't remember all his strategies. They remembered that when chaos arrived, Thomas didn't. He responded with stillness. He made decisions from principle. He lived like a mountain, weathered, grounded, unshakable. What you take from this story is yours to decide. But if there is a single truth to carry with you, let it be this. The most powerful life is not the one that demands attention, but the one that commands respect in silence. You don't need to be loud. You need to be aligned. You don't need a crowd. You need clarity. You don't need permission. You need conviction. This world will always tempt you with distraction, comfort, applause, and shortcuts. But none of them lead to power. None of them lead to legacy. Only the path of self-mastery does. And that path is open to you now. Start with the basics. Master your emotions. Reclaim your thoughts. Train your discipline. Learn to observe. Speak with purpose. Adapt without apology. Influence without manipulation. Move with timing. Lead without needing to be followed. And above all, live with cold, quiet power, the kind that bends the world without raising your voice. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are not too old, too young, too far behind. What you are is one decision away from the path. And once you begin, you will never walk the same again. This is not just a story, it's an invitation to live with intention, to think with clarity, to lead with depth, to become, in every room you enter, a force, not of noise, but of undeniable presence. If this story moved you, then make the next move yours. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more, and share your thoughts, your journey, or your challenge in the comments below. Because transformation doesn't happen in silence. It begins with a choice. Make yours now.